Considering the enormous impact that previous trade deals have had on all of our lives and on the lives of our country, it's a little bit surprising to me, frankly, that the media isn't giving more coverage than it is. It's getting some coverage, but it's surprising to me that it's not getting more coverage, that Donald Trump right now is in the process of trying to get a new trade deal approved that's being called NAFTA 2.0. That's not the official name, but that's how a lot of people are referring to it. So here to update us now on that struggle and what it means for us is Lori Wallach. Lori directs Public Citizens Global Trade Watch program. She's been involved in the trade issue for many years, including the congressional trade battles over NAFTA 1.0 back in the 1990s. She knows this stuff backwards and forwards, and it's always a pleasure to talk to her. So, Lori, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. And I saw just before we called you that that there's a new study out from you guys about the types of corporations that are pushing Congress to approve Trump's, NAFTA 2.0, for lack of a better, I know it has an official name, but to push this trade deal, what's it called? The USMCA, right? The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And the nature of the corporations, the special interests pushing this deal, are very interesting and very telling. So do you mind saying a little bit about what you found?
You bet. So here's the backstory, which you and I have discussed for your audience before, which is everyone, I think, agrees NAFTA 1.0 was a disaster. Instead of the benefits we were promised, almost 1 million U.S. jobs have been certified by the government as outsourced due to NAFTA. Plus, there have been hundreds of millions paid to multinational corporations after attacks, investor-state dispute settlement attacks in our environmental and health laws. So the renegotiation of NAFTA has been something I think a lot of people have wanted to do. The version of it that President Trump signed, his renegotiated NAFTA, fixed some important things like whacking investor-state dispute settlement, but it added some new bad stuff, like new monopolies for pharmaceutical firms to lock in high medicine prices, and it didn't get to the level it needed on environmental and labor standards in order to actually make a difference, to stop the outsourcing, to stop the race to the bottom in wages. So where things are situated now, you've got a bunch of corporations trying to railroad the damn thing through Congress as is. And then you've got labor unions and Democrats in Congress and consumer groups like Public Citizen all saying, okay, some improvements there, but doesn't cut it, as is, can't be for it. Gotta take the pharma stuff out and put real labor and environmental standards that are really enforced in. And that kind of a replacement of NAFTA would be worth having. The one as is, no, it needs more work. So as that is the backstory, I started thinking, who the heck are these corporations that are trying to railroad the damn thing through right now in its half-baked state? And, not a shocker, it's the same coalition of chronic U.S. job outsourcers and pharma companies that railroaded NAFTA 1.0 through in the 90s. So we actually took the names of the corporations who are in these two big corporate coalitions that are bragging about spending tens of millions of dollars to pass the deal Trump signed last year right now. And we looked at what their record was from the U.S. government, from the Department of Labor, vis-a-vis government-certified trade-related job loss. And we found that these companies are responsible for 500,000 trade-related job losses. So you've got the companies that are chronic job outsourcers who are for NAFTA 1.0 saying, ooh, this NAFTA 2.0 is great. Then you have the people representing workers and consumers saying, not so fast. And that is what this study shows.
So, okay, and I'm looking at it now. First of all, you identified 90 companies that are members of either the USMCA Coalition, which is convened by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, not usually fond of their work, or the past USMCA Coalition, very similar sounding names. Now, past USMCA is run by a former Trump deputy chief of staff and is co-chaired by Representative Joe Crowley, who Democratic fans of reading about Democratic Party politics will recognize as being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's opponent, losing his seat in Congress to her in the primary. Now, so let me ask you this. A lot of people might be wondering, okay, old NAFTA was no good. This is at best marginally better. So why are the companies that invested their money and influence in pushing NAFTA trying to push this thing? You might say, well, why don't they just ignore it and not spend the money on it? Why are they so deeply invested in passing this one too?
Because they know that there's this big coalition of unions, environmental and consumer groups, and Democrats in Congress who are trying to push the president to actually finish the job of fixing NAFTA. And finishing the job would mean for those pharma companies who are funding a lot of this, getting rid of the extra monopolies they stuck into NAFTA 2.0 that would block competition and keep medicine prices high, basically undermining the congressional Democrats' #1 campaign pledge on which they took a majority. And the non-pharmaceutical companies, the outsourcing companies, they know another of the demands we're pushing and the Democrats are pushing is to actually have strong and enforceable labor and environmental standards, which is to say, to make it such that they can't continue to pay workers in Mexico working in plants identical to the high-tech robotics using fancy plants in the U.S., paying people there less per day than they have to pay U.S. workers per hour, like $2 an hour in Mexico for a high-end auto plant or computer monitor plant. And the companies don't want to actually have to pay decent wages or clean up the environment. So they want to railroad through the NAFTA revision that got signed now and not have any of these further improvements made. Meanwhile, Speaker Pelosi and even the chairman of the trade committees, who frequently are not that progressive, the Democrats, have all said, this is not ready for prime time. Yes, some improvements were made, but not enough to make it worthwhile. Got to finish the job or it can't get a vote. These companies are trying to get it railroaded through without the changes. That's what's going on.
So that's the secret here. So now let's talk a little bit about those pharma provisions, because, I have a tendency, I'll admit it, to be a little histrionic in the way I put things. But it seems to me like those pharmacy provisions are basically, they're trading human life for maximized profits. They're giving corporations veto power over the rights of nations and democracies to save the lives of their own citizens. So I really hate the pharma provisions in this NAFTA 2.0 deal. Am I overstating the case, as is my wont from time to time?
You're not really overstating the case. The reality is that those provisions would lock in place a bunch of special monopoly protections in the United States and export our existing bad U.S. policies to Mexico and Canada, so that Congress would be handcuffed from making the changes that have been promised to bring down medicine prices here, and would be forced into longer, Mexico and Canada would be forced into longer monopoly periods that would raise medicine prices in Mexico and Canada. And to be very specific about this, folks who think this sounds, histrionic, can go to our website, which is tradewatch.org, which, by the way, go to the Huffington Post website, read the story that was just released on the corporate study, but you can look at the data from the corporate study at tradewatch.org also. At www.tradewatch.org, look at our NAFTA website, and you can walk through the provisions in the actual text, it's Chapter 20 of the revised NAFTA, that would lock in these pharma goodies. And there's three overarching things. Number one, for biologic medicines, those are those mainly cutting-edge new medicines that are being used to treat cancer with less side effects, some key vaccines, some of the anti-inflammatories that people use now for rheumatoid arthritis. These drugs would be locked in with special monopolies on top of their monopolies when legislation is in Congress right now to roll back that extra protectionism for pharmaceutical companies. Number two, some existing medicines will get dragged into that category of longer monopolies, so the prices would go up. And that includes some diabetes drugs, some osteoporosis drugs that right now are expensive enough, but would get worse if they were recategorized under the revised NAFTA. And then number three is locking in a bunch of things that are called patent evergreening. These are ways in which pharmaceutical companies get extensions on their monopolies without ever doing anything new or creative that deserves an extension or a new monopoly. So, for instance, you come up with a chemical, you get a patent on it for one thing, and then you realize, oh, it doesn't just do that thing, it has this other effect. I'm going to get a second patent, even though you haven't created anything new. In fact, it could have been you found out because of the adverse reporting for your one use. So those kind of scams would get locked in forever. It's very serious because, as you've said, this is a matter of life and death for a lot of people, not just here, but in Mexico and Canada. So that stuff has to come out.
No, I think that's very well said and very clear. And also, to be clear, since we're talking about life and death, saving lives in Mexico and Canada as well as the United States, we're talking about trying to help workers in all three countries as well too. We're not right. I mean, that this is part of the deal involves better working conditions, better wages for workers in all three countries, and making sure that we have that instead of a race to the bottom. Am I mischaracterizing?
Nope, that's exactly right. And that is the big difference between progressives and Trump. So anyone who is actually not one of the pharmaceutical companies or the job outsources at this point will admit that NAFTA did not work out well. You can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, you can be an independent. You can't get away from the Department of Labor list of 1 million jobs that got sacked because of NAFTA. It's just the reality. The difference is the progressives, the Democrats, the unions, the environmental and consumer groups, we look at this and say, what's good for people and the planet in all three countries? And those are the changes we want. That's why we're fighting, not just for the changes in the pharmaceutical chapter or in the environmental and labor rules that are good for people in the United States, but rather we're looking at it as what's good for people in North America. Right now, there's a lot of corporate rigging. Companies in all three, big multinational companies in all three countries, got goodies in there. So when we're making demands, we're saying things like, hey, for people to have access to medicine, regardless of which of the three countries they reside, you got to get rid of these extra monopolies that block the generic competition that brings down drug prices for all three countries' consumers. Or to have decent working conditions and wages, all three countries have to have the ability for workers to have independent unions where you vote for the contract that you negotiate for, and it set terms where you collectively bargain to actually set terms to try and benefit the workers. So Mexico has had a system of fake protection unions for a century, basically effectively like a company, but it's part of one of the old political parties, will come in, so-called negotiate a contract, and basically sit with the boss. They come up with terms. The workers never vote on it. The contract gets registered. Then when the workers decide that they're being abused, they're not being paid fairly, etc., they go on strike, they go to jail. Because they violated the contract. They didn't know they have it. They never approved. That's a sweetheart deal between the boss that's now been registered in federal law. So one of the provisions in NAFTA, and this is one of the things that makes it worth fighting to finish that work, to fix it. This is a good thing that's in there. This has to be harvested by getting the rest of the stuff that is needed done. This provision says all 500,000 of those fake contracts need to be dumped, and real contracts have to be renegotiated within 4 years. And Mexican labor law has to be changed so that workers get a private ballot vote on their contract as a condition for it being registered. That would be a huge honking difference. That would be the beginning of real labor rights in Mexico. The problem is,
and we've only got about a minute left. So
I'm just going to say the problem is right now it's not enforceable. So the unions are fighting to get that enforced. And that's why the companies are trying to railroad it through without the enforcement.
Right, because the companies, including the American companies that outsource, are reaping the benefits of the lack of workers' rights.
They don't want the benefits, exactly.
Right.
They don't want decent wages.
And in the 30 seconds or so we have left, or minute we have left, politics of this. I assume as a treaty, could the Senate ratify it at this point? What can people, are Democrats holding together on preventing it from going through as is? What do you think is going to happen?
So it's not ratified as a treaty. It needs to be passed by simple majorities of the House and the Senate, and the fight is in the House, folks. So if you care about the future of the environment and wages and income inequality and human rights in North America, then get to your member of the House of Representatives. The message is super simple. Get them to pledge to you they will not support the current deal unless and until, 1, the pharma goodies come out, and 2, real labor and environmental standards that are strongly enforced go in. That NAFTA replacement is worth having. If the Democrats in the House of Representatives do not insist on that, we could end up with the worse than the status quo NAFTA replacement that got signed last year.
Well, great. I always ask my guests, Lori, what can people do to help? But I didn't even have to ask you. You offered it, and I'm really glad you did. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Lori Wallach is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Thanks for the great work, and thanks for the update.
Thank you. And for folks to get fact sheets and instructions about how to set up a meeting or meet with activists who want to go to meetings with you, with your member of Congress, go to tradewatch.org. That's www.tradewatch.org. Activist kits there, just waiting to be printed out.
Perfect.